Usually when structural engineers are assessing a skyscraper,
Mhm.
the process is, well, it's relentlessly binary.
Right.
You know, they use ultrasonic testing or maybe ground-penetrating radar or industrial X-rays.
Yeah, they scan the load-bearing pillars.
Exactly. And the results are just right there on the monitor, like a microfracture in the steel or a void in the concrete. The data points to the exact millimeter where the structural integrity is compromised.
Right, the failure is visible. It's categorized.
And most importantly, it is quantifiable before the building collapses. You can look at the scan and say, with, absolute certainty, if we do not reinforce this specific column, the entire structure is going to come down.
Which is great, right? I mean, it provides this really comforting illusion of control. We desperately want the mechanics of our world, especially the structures that house us, to be that legible.
But diagnosing the structural integrity of a civilization,
Yeah, that's different.
that X-ray machine just doesn't exist. You cannot put a society into a scanner and locate the exact microfracture in its social foundation.
No, definitely not.
When a civilization is failing, the symptoms are ubiquitous. You get economic stagnation, civil unrest, institutional decay. But isolating the precise load-bearing column that snapped.
The actual moment the foundation gave way.
Right. That's notoriously difficult while you're actually living inside the building. But today, we are attempting to run that diagnostic scan.
We are. We're taking a very sharp sociological look at an ancient text.
Specifically, the Quranic narrative of Prophet Salih and the people of Thamud. And for those referencing the source text along with us, this is Surah Hud, Ayat 61 through 68.
Right. And the sources we're examining today argue that this text is not, a collection of ancient folklore.
Not at all.
It's actually a highly sophisticated, rigorously structured critique of economic inequality and really the structural failures of human societies.
Now, the analytical lens we are using to examine this text is primarily the Parwezian view.
Yes.
So this is a methodological framework developed by scholars like Ghulam Ahmed Parwez in the 20th century.
Exactly. And what this framework does is it systematically strips away the centuries of, mythological embellishment.
Magical realism.
Right, all the magical stuff that is kind of accreted around these ancient narratives over time. So instead of reading them as supernatural bedtime stories, this approach analyzes the linguistic roots of the classical Arabic.
And it interprets the text as a profound treatise on, social physics, human psychology, and economic justice.
Which is fascinating. The premise of our sources today is that the text is documenting immutable laws of human history, like structural failures that just play out on a repeating loop.
And this is a big but. If we are going to treat this text as a serious sociological diagnostic tool, we have to immediately confront the elephant in the room, or, the camel in the room.
The she-camel.
The she-camel, the most famous and, frankly, the most jarring element of this specific narrative.
Yeah.
The Naqat-Allah.
Right, the camel of God.
Because, reading this text with a modern analytical mind, you hit this part of the story and the brain just kind of stops.
Yeah, it's a huge speed bump.
The traditional literalist interpretation asks the reader to picture a giant, biological, miraculous camel physically stepping out of a solid rock mountain.
A literal magic trick.
Exactly. And if the mission of this deep dive is to explore ancient macroeconomics and social physics, a magic camel appearing out of a boulder feels like a massive leap into fantasy.
It really does.
So I have to push back on this framework right from the start. Like, when we read about a miraculous she-camel, are we just supposed to picture a giant magical animal? How do we get from a biological animal in an ancient desert story to, a complex municipal or economic policy?
That's the core question.
Because, honestly, translating a camel into a macroeconomic concept feels like reverse engineering the text to fit a modern political agenda.
And look, that skepticism is completely warranted. If you look at this through the lens of modern literalism, it absolutely reads like a fairy tale.
Totally.
But the Parwezian methodology doesn't just invent metaphors out of thin air. It relies very heavily on classical Arabic linguistics and the socioeconomic context of pre-Islamic Arabia.
Okay, so take us back there. What's the context?
Well, before the Abbasid era, when a lot of the more fantastical theological interpretations were codified, classical Arabic was a language doubly tied to the physical environment. to survival.
Right.
The root word for this camel, naqa, in its broader linguistic usage, often relates to extracting or drawing something out.
Like drawing water.
Exactly. Much like drawing water from a well or deriving sustenance from the earth. And in an ancient agrarian and pastoral society, livestock, specifically the camel, was the ultimate manifestation of wealth, of endurance and resources.
Okay, so the animal is acting as a stand-in for the broader concept of capital or resources.
More specifically, the Parwezian view interprets the camel of God as representing the public sector.
Oh, wow. The public sector.
Or the protected public commons. Consider the environment of the Thamud, the natural resources that sustain life, water sources, natural pastures, the raw materials of the earth. Those are the foundation of their entire economy. In the ancient Near East, a camel grazing freely on the land without being hindered or claimed by a private owner. That was a physical, breathing manifestation of a shared resource.
It represented the commons.
Yes. So when the text presents Salih delivering his message to the elites of Thamud, the Parwezian analysis argues he wasn't demanding they revere a literal sacred pet.
He wasn't saying, hey, be nice to this magic animal.
No. It was a radical economic demand. He was pointing to the vital resources of their society and laying down an economic litmus test.
So what was the test?
He was basically saying, leave this public resource alone so the marginalized can benefit from it. Do not privatize what inherently belongs to the public.
That entirely recontextualizes the conflict. It shifts the narrative from a zoological miracle to a high-stakes debate over privatization and resource allocation.
It's an economic litmus test.
Right.
Yeah.
If we view the camel as the public sector, Salih is essentially pointing at the ancient equivalent of, like, the public water grid, or the nationalized energy reserves, or the shared agricultural land,
Exactly.
and saying, you cannot put a toll booth on this.
Yes, this belongs to everyone.
Which really frames our entire deep dive for you, the listener. We are exploring the ethics of ownership. We are examining how our sources map this ancient narrative directly onto the persistent historical struggles between an ultra-wealthy, elite hoarding resources and a working class demanding basic survival rights.
And to accurately analyze that struggle, we have to understand the specific structural engineering of the Thamud civilization.
Right, because they weren't just, scraping by.
Not at all. The source text goes to great lengths to establish that the Thamud were not primitive. They were not cave dwellers struggling in the desert. They were a highly advanced, technologically sophisticated society.
The apex of civilization in their time.
Absolutely. The text specifically highlights their architectural prowess, how they carved massive, intricate palaces directly out of the mountains, and they built sprawling fortresses in the plains.
Carving palaces into solid rock.
Yeah. These were feats of ancient engineering that required immense labor, advanced geometry, and significant wealth.
The sources describe these as monuments to their own perceived invincibility. And, it is difficult not to compare this to the modern architectural flexes of extreme wealth.
Oh, the parallels are striking.
We look at massive, gravity-defying skyscrapers today, or luxury underground survival bunkers that tech billionaires are building, or private space programs.
Right, monumental vanity projects.
The Thamud conquered their harsh physical environment in a similar way, but doing that requires massive capital and labor. The palaces carved into mountains weren't built by the ruling class with chisels in their hands.
No, the billionaires weren't out there breaking rocks.
They were built by extracting the labor of the working class, the stonecutters, the weavers, the small farmers. The Thamud constructed their glittering civilization on the backs of an exploited, marginalized labor force.
And that underlying exploitation brings us to a crucial linguistic anchor in the text. It's found in Ayat 61, and it really unlocks the entire philosophical premise of the narrative.
Okay, let's get into it.
The word is istamarakum. The verse states, "He brought you forth from the earth and settled you therein." Or, more actively translated in our sources, made you build it, or demanded that you develop it.
Okay, so let's run a diagnostic on that specific word. What is the linguistic weight of istamarakum? Why does the Parwezian framework anchor so much of its sociological theory on this single term?
The weight lies in its Arabic root, AMR. This is the exact root from which the Arabic language derives concepts like colonization, development, civilization, and population.
So it's literally about building a civilization.
Exactly. The text is actively acknowledging the technological and architectural prowess of the Thamud. It's not denying their achievements. It is stating clearly, you have fulfilled the physical act of developing the earth. You have built a civilization.
Which is a huge point. The philosophical implication here is incredibly sharp. The divine mandate, according to the framework analyzing this text, is not asceticism.
Right. It's not about hiding away.
The goal of humanity is not to renounce the material world, sit in a cave, and merely pray for the afterlife. The actual assignment, the very purpose of human existence on this planet, is to develop the Earth, to innovate, to construct, to advance technologically.
It is a remarkably progressive stance for an ancient text, honestly. The development of the physical world is presented as a primary duty.
Got it.
But there is a vital caveat, which the sources define as the Salih test.
The Salih test.
Yes, you are mandated to build civilization. But if your development, your technological advancement, and your magnificent economy functions solely to serve an elite 1% while the rest of the population lives in poverty or starvation, you have failed the test of Istamarakom.
So the physical development must be matched by economic equity.
Exactly.
I need to introduce a counter-argument here, though. Looking at this through the lens of modern economic theory. Historically, monopolies and concentrations of immense wealth have often been incredibly efficient engines for rapid development.
That's true.
I mean, the extreme wealth of the 1% funded the Roman aqueducts, the Renaissance, and arguably the modern digital infrastructure. So if the divine mandate is to build and develop the Earth, why does the text view the Thamud's methodology as a failure?
Good question.
If the palaces were built, if the mountains were carved, didn't the development actually happen? Why does the distribution of the wealth negate the architectural achievement?
The source material addresses that exact defense through the concept of Fasad.
Facade.
Yes, the text does not view technological progress in a vacuum. Fasad translates roughly to corruption, disorder, or a fundamental imbalance.
Like a structural flaw.
Exactly. The framework posits that a society can be highly advanced technologically, yet deeply diseased sociologically. If you build a flawless aqueduct, but only the elite are legally permitted to drink the water, the structure of your society is in a state of facade.
It's corrupt at its core.
Right. The sources emphasize that class stratification, the artificial categorization of humans into a high-born elite who own the resources and a low-born labor class who are denied access to the fruits of the civilization they physically built.
The very people who carved the stone.
Exactly. That is the ultimate corruption. It is an affront to the purpose of human development, because the development is meant to elevate the entire human species, not just a select ruling board.
That dynamic perfectly sets the sociological stage for the conflict. The Thamud possess this glittering, highly unequal society. They are sitting in their mountain fortresses, completely secure in their economic dominance.
And enter Prophet Salih.
Enter Salih. According to the text, his core message to his people is incredibly concise. Worship God.
Yes.
Now, to a modern listener, worship usually implies a change in Sunday routine. Attending a different temple, reciting different prayers, performing a new set of rituals.
Right. Very personal piety.
But if we apply the Parwezian sociological lens, worship God is not a plea for better attendance at the local shrine.
Not at all. In this analytical framework, the concept of worshiping a single creator is a deeply political and economic stance.
Political? How so?
Well, in the context of the ancient world, and specifically the Thamud saying worship only God, carried a very specific subversive translation. It meant, no human being has the right to exercise absolute authority or rule over another human being.
Oh, wow. That moves the concept entirely out of theology and directly into sovereignty and jurisprudence.
Yes, it is a direct assault on the legal foundation of their society.
Because the elites relied on the old gods, right?
Exactly. Ancient power structures were heavily reliant on pantheons of deities, not just for spiritual comfort, but as literal property deeds.
Property deeds.
The ruling elites often claimed descent from specific gods, or they claimed that specific deities had granted them divine right over the land, the water, and the people.
And I'm guessing the priests backed them up.
Of course. The priestly class validated these claims in exchange for a share of the wealth. Therefore, when Salih says, worship only God, he is systematically undercutting the despotic, capitalist system the elites had built.
It's brilliant.
Because if only one universal God is sovereign, then the elite class cannot claim a divine exclusive right to own the earth. They cannot hoard its resources. They cannot treat the working class as their property.
So the message meant dismantling the human hierarchies that allowed one group to economically enslave another.
Yes.
He isn't preaching a new ritual. He is walking into the executive boardroom of the civilization and demanding total systemic land reform.
That is the perfect way to put it.
And the reaction of the elite class to this demand is documented in Ayat 62. Our sources highlight this as a masterclass in human psychology.
It really is.
The elites look at Salih, a man demanding the end of their monopoly, and their response is, "You were a man of hope among us before this."
A man of hope. That specific phrase reveals the entire social dynamic at play.
What does it tell us about who he was?
It tells us who Salih was before he took this revolutionary stance. He wasn't a disenfranchised outcast. He wasn't some fringe radical yelling on the outskirts of the city.
Right.
He was an insider. He was highly respected, fiercely intelligent, charismatic, and clearly identified by the society's power brokers as a rising star.
He was the golden child of their institutions.
Yes.
The ruling class looked at his brilliance and calculated his trajectory. They fully expected him to join their ranks, sit on their councils, maybe marry into their influential families.
They wanted to co-opt him.
Exactly. And ultimately use his immense intellect to optimize and defend their existing system. They banked on him being a foundational pillar of their monopoly.
Which brings up a critical observation made in our source material regarding the nature of institutional power and religion.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
The ruling class, whether in ancient Thamud or in modern historical contexts, actually embraces and promotes a religious man, provided he adheres to a very specific, sanitized role.
A quiet priest.
Exactly. If a brilliant moral figure is willing to stay quietly within the confines of a temple, preaching about personal piety, individual spiritual purity.
And telling the poor to be patient.
Yes. Advising the impoverished working class to be patient with their earthly suffering because they will be richly rewarded in the afterlife. Well, the elite power structure will fully support him.
They'll build him a bigger temple.
They will fund his institutions. They will grant him societal prestige.
Because that version of religion is not a threat. It functions as a structural anesthetic.
An aesthetic, yes.
If the workers believe their poverty is a divine test to be endured quietly, they don't unionize, they don't strike, they don't demand access to the water springs. The factory keeps running.
But the moment
that same highly respected, intellectually gifted figure steps outside the sanctuary.
and applies his moral authority to the physical economic world.
Right. The moment he demands equitable resource distribution and the dismantling of monopolies, his status instantly shifts. He goes from being their greatest hope to a profound disappointment.
You were a man of hope before this. The disappointment is the shock of a betrayed investment.
They invested in him, and he turned on them.
Salih weaponized the very moral authority and intellect they respected against their economic interests. He committed the ultimate societal treason. He betrayed his class destiny.
Wow.
He was groomed to be the intellectual architect of the elite, and instead he became the advocate for the stonecutters, the weavers, and the marginalized.
So the elite's reaction in Ayat 62 is not a theological debate about the nature of God.
Not at all.
It is the furious realization that their smartest asset has turned against the machine.
Exactly.
The parallels to modern institutional capture are just. They're glaring. For you listening, you see this when highly intelligent individuals are recruited into powerful modern systems.
Absolutely.
Whether it's corporate finance, elite political circles, or legacy institutions. The system identifies a brilliant mind, runs them through the right universities, fast-tracks them for leadership, and assumes they will play the game.
And usually they do.
Usually they do. But if that individual reaches the executive level, analyzes the profit margins versus the living conditions of the labor force, and attempts to fundamentally alter the power structure.
Say, by attempting to distribute equity to the workers.
Or blowing the whistle on predatory practices.
Right.
They're immediately labeled a pariah. They're no longer a man of hope. The institution will mobilize to excommunicate them and destroy their credibility, specifically because an insider who turns against the system is the most dangerous threat of all.
And that perfectly transitions our analysis into the actual mechanics of the Thamud machine.
Okay, let's get into the gears.
What was the specific economic engine they were fighting over? Our sources provide a detailed breakdown of the socioeconomic realities of this region.
Right, because despite their advanced stone architecture, the baseline economy of Thamud, like most of pre-Islamic Arabia, was heavily reliant on agriculture and livestock.
Yes, and in an agrarian, semi-arid environment, what is the single non-negotiable variable for survival?
Water.
Water.
Without unrestricted access to springs, aquifers, and the grazing lands sustained by that water, the entire society collapses. It is the literal lifeblood of the economy.
Exactly. And the structural failure of Thamud the Fasad we discussed earlier was rooted in a massive, violent enclosure of the commons.
They privatized the water.
Yes. The elite class had claimed absolute private ownership over the vital water sources and the prime grazing lands.
Unbelievable.
They drew borders around the springs, likely enforced by physical violence or hired militias, and declared, "This belongs exclusively to us."
Consequently, the working class, who required water for their own survival, their families, and their small flocks, were entirely severed from the fundamental resources of life.
They were trapped.
They could only access the water by paying exorbitant rents, or by submitting to indentured servitude, working the elite's lands just to earn enough water to survive another day.
It is a perfect, inescapable economic monopoly on the basic right to exist.
Because if you control the only water source in a desert, you control the population completely. And this forces us to re-examine the Treaty of the Camel. Because as you established earlier, the Parwezian framework reads the camel not as a pet, but as a legally binding test of access.
Yes, an economic treaty.
The confrontation documented in Ayat 64 is the climax of this economic standoff. Salih brings forward this symbol of the public sector, and the text records him using two highly specific paired terms.
Right. Naqat-Allah, meaning the camel of God.
And Ardhul.
Yes, meaning the earth of God.
And his demand is explicitly recorded. This is the camel of God, so leave her to graze on the earth of God.
The entire philosophical architecture of this narrative seems to rest on those two terms.
It really does. So how does the source text define the earth of God in a legal or economic sense?
Well, by utilizing the term earth of God, Salih is establishing a profound foundational premise of sociological jurisprudence.
Which is?
That the physical earth and its life-sustaining resources belong to the Creator, and by extension are the shared inheritance of all the Creator's creatures.
It is a direct rejection of absolute privatization.
Precisely. The text argues that no single human being and no corporate entity of elites possesses the inherent right to draw arbitrary lines in the dirt, claim exclusive ownership over the natural resources required for human survival, and allow the public to starve outside those lines.
So the fundamental aquifers, the air, the natural pastures.
These are classified by the text as public trusts, not private commodities.
And the camel of God operates as the physical enforcement of that trust.
Precisely. The camel grazing freely, unhindered by the elite's borders, was the physical proof of the public's right of access.
It was the test case for the treaty.
Yes. If the elites allowed the camel to drink from the enclosed springs and graze on the privatized land, they were legally acknowledging the existence of a public sector.
They were conceding that their monopoly was not absolute.
Right. And that certain resources belonged inherently to the community. Salih's treaty essentially stated, if you claim to respect the divine order, you must respect the public's inalienable right to access the earth.
I have to challenge this premise heavily on behalf of modern legal systems.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because the concept of private property is the bedrock of contemporary global economics.
It is.
Modern law dictates that if an individual's ancestors purchased a plot of land, or acquired it through historical conquest, or developed it, they hold the legal deed.
Right.
They are legally entitled to build a fence around the lake on that land. They are legally entitled to dawdle the water from that aquifer and sell it back to the public at a premium.
Which happens every day.
Constantly. So how does the Parwezian interpretation of this ancient text counter the modern, deeply entrenched legal framework of property rights? Is the text arguing that all private property is illegitimate?
No. The source material introduces a highly nuanced distinction here. The text does not condemn the ownership of the fruits of one's labor.
Okay.
You can own the house you physically built. You can own the cloth you wove.
So what's the issue?
The radical challenge applies specifically to the monopolization of inherent pre-existing natural resources necessary for survival. The framework forces us to examine the origin point of that ownership. If you trace the private deed of a fundamental natural resource back through history, what is the genesis of that deed?
Where did it come from originally?
Right. The source logic argues that you rarely find someone who manufactured the river or synthesized the land.
You can't build a river.
Exactly. You inevitably reach a historical moment where an individual or a group simply possessed enough military force, enough weaponry, or enough consolidated political power to draw a line and declare, this is mine.
Just through sheer force.
And they then constructed legal systems to legitimize and protect that original use of force.
So the text is fundamentally arguing that the original enclosure of the commons was an act of violence, a crime against the public trust.
That is the core argument. Yes, the text views life-sustaining resources as freely provided for all living creatures.
Right.
To monopolize them, to hold the survival of the working class hostage in exchange for labor or wealth, is an act of arrogance that attempts to usurp the role of the creator.
Because you're playing God with people's survival.
Exactly. The Parwezian view insists that permitting absolute private ownership over the public's means of survival is the root cause of societal facade.
It is the exact structural microfracture that eventually brings the skyscraper down.
That's exactly it.
So, Salih lays down the terms of the treaty. He demands that they allow the camel to graze, acknowledging the public commons and sharing the water.
Yeah.
It is a demand for baseline economic equity.
Yes.
How does the elite class of Thamud respond to this challenge to their monopoly?
Well, the text in Ayat 65 states that they reach their breaking point, and they hamstring the she-camel.
They hamstring it.
Yeah.
Now, once again, moving away from the literal image of injuring an animal, how does the sociological framework translate the act of hamstringing?
It translates it as a violent, decisive legislative act. To hamstring the camel means they officially and irrevocably destroyed the public sector.
They killed it entirely.
They didn't just casually reject Salih's treaty, they took deliberate action to ensure that a public commons could no longer functionally exist.
They doubled down on their monopoly.
Yes. They permanently severed the marginalized class from any legal or physical access to the resources required for survival. In modern terms, they completely deregulated their own monopolies and legislated the public sector out of existence.
They looked at the demand for a fair share, and their response was total extraction. They squeezed the working class until the absolute limit of human endurance was reached.
And that leads us to the consequence.
Which brings us to the catastrophic consequence detailed in Ayat 67. The text describes the destruction of the society, stating that a shout, the Arabic word used, is Sayha overtook the wrongdoers.
And here we must apply the Parwezian lens one final critical time to strip away the supernatural veneer.
Right, because this wasn't a magic noise.
No, the text is not describing a giant literal voice booming from the stratosphere, or a magical acoustic weapon that induced mass cardiac arrest.
So what is the Sayha?
The sociological framework interprets the Sayha as the ultimate manifestation of social physics.
Social physics.
The shout represents a massive, uncontrollable social shockwave.
I want to break down the mechanics of a social shockwave. If we accept the premise that hamstringing the camel represents the destruction of the public sector, how does that specific economic policy generate a physical collapse of the civilization?
The sources ask us to visualize the society as a massive industrial steam boiler.
Okay, a boiler.
The marginalized working class represents the water inside the boiler. The natural resources, the water, the land, the wealth represent the heat and the expansion space they require to simply exist.
Right.
When the elite class hamstrings the public sector, when they aggressively monopolize all the wealth and seal off the springs, they are systematically welding shut every single pressure release valve on that boiler.
Oh, wow.
They're depriving the masses of their baseline survival needs while continuously applying the intense heat of labor extraction and economic exploitation.
And the laws of thermodynamics dictate that the pressure must find an outlet.
Exactly. You build immense, unbearable, unquantifiable pressure within the social boiler.
And the elites of Thamud, sitting in their intricately carved mountain fortresses, they probably believed their advanced engineering and their private security forces could contain that pressure indefinitely.
They believed their structural power was absolute. But when the public sector is entirely eradicated, when the masses are starving outside the walls of the enclosed springs and realize they have absolutely nothing left to lose,
The boiler explodes.
the inevitable result is a violent, explosive rupture. The Sayha is the deafening roar of a populist revolution.
The shout of the masses.
Yes. It is the chaotic, destructive crash of total systemic collapse. The civilization does not fall because of a supernatural acoustic event. It falls because the elites ignored the fundamental laws of social physics and engineered their own destruction.
It is a terrifyingly precise cause and effect relationship. You squeeze the foundation of the pyramid too intensely, you extract all the structural integrity to reinforce the top.
And eventually the base material fails.
And when the base shatters, the entire multi-billion-dollar mountain-carved superstructure collapses under its own weight.
Exactly.
The narrative implies it is not a divine fairy tale punishment. It is merely the physics of human societal structures.
Yeah.
You cannot sustain a civilization where the vast majority of the population is systematically denied the fundamental right to exist comfortably.
And the aftermath of this collapse, as described in Ayat 68, is chilling in its brevity.
What does it say?
The text states they were left prostrate in their homes as if they had never existed at all.
Left prostrate.
Consider the immense wealth, the advanced technology, the massive mountain fortresses we discussed at the beginning of our deep dive. They were rendered completely useless.
The bunkers didn't save them.
The elites constructed their impregnable bunkers to defend against external military threats, completely blind to the fact that the actual threat was the internal social pressure they were actively building.
Right.
Their uncompromising monopoly is what ultimately destroyed them.
They engineered the strongest load-bearing walls in the ancient world, but they starved the people living inside them.
That is the tragic irony of the Thamud narrative. They easily passed the mandate of Istamaricum regarding technological development.
They built the civilization.
But they catastrophically failed the test of human equity and resource distribution.
Let's synthesize the vast diagnostic scan we've just run. We began with a narrative that, on the surface, appeared to be an ancient, impenetrable myth about a miraculous camel.
Right.
But by applying this rigorous sociological and linguistic framework, we have uncovered a brutally sharp treatise on the ethics of ownership.
It really is.
The source text operates as a detailed warning regarding the inherent instability of extreme monopolies, the absolute necessity of protecting the public sector, and the inevitable, highly destructive social shockwaves that detonate when extreme inequality is allowed to build unchecked.
And honestly, the most profound insight from these sources is the recognition of their analytical sophistication. These texts are diagnosing structural flaws in human society that are identical to the flaws we face today.
Identical.
The variables change. We trade stone-carved mountain palaces for silicon chips, digital monopolies, and orbital technology.
Right.
But the foundational dynamics of power, the hoarding of resources, and the building of social pressure remain entirely unchanged. The laws of social physics are static.
Which brings us to the conclusion of today's deep dive. But it merely sets the stage for the next phase of the text.
Yes, it does.
Because in our next session, we are leaving the desolate, socially collapsed, ruined landscape of Thamud. We're moving forward in the source material to Ayat 69.
And it is a massive pivot in both scenery and narrative tone. The text moves us from the ruins of a collapsed empire to the quiet, unassuming tents of Prophet Ibrahim.
It's quite a shift.
And the narrative introduces the arrival of messengers who bring what the text explicitly calls good news.
Now, given the incredibly layered socio-political nature of the text we've just analyzed, we have to approach this next section with the same diagnostic scrutiny.
We really do.
We have to ask, is this merely good news for Ibrahim's immediate family, a private domestic blessing? Or, considering everything we have just explored regarding the violent overturning of corrupt monopolistic systems, is this good news actually the formal announcement of a massive new global movement designed to challenge these power structures?
You will definitely apply the Parwezian lens to that mystery in our next deep dive.
It could be a good one.
The contrast will be analytically fascinating. Moving from the violent implosion of Thamud's monopolies to the quiet structural beginnings of Ibrahim's movement provides a completely different model of social engineering to examine.
Until we run that next diagnostic, I want to leave you, the listener, with a specific lens through which to view your own world. We began by noting how difficult it is to diagnose the structural rot of a society while you are living within it.
It's the hardest thing to see.
But the narrative of Salih provides a very specific diagnostic tool. Look at the structural engineering of your own society today.
What do you see?
What are the modern she-camels? What are the vital public resources, whether it is healthcare access, clean water aquifers, digital infrastructure, or affordable housing, that are currently being enclosed, privatized, and hamstrung by the ultra-wealthy?
Right.
And if the fundamental laws of social physics have remained entirely unchanged since the era of the Salih, what kind of social shockwave is currently building pressure right beneath our feet?